18-year-old Alyssa Bustamante sat in that Missouri courtroom wearing a slight smirk that made every parent's blood run cold. The prosecutor was describing how she had strangled 9-year-old Elizabeth Olten, slit her throat, and stabbed her repeatedly before burying her in a pre-dug grave. As Elizabeth's mother collapsed sobbing in the front row, Alyssa actually laughed, not a nervous giggle or an uncomfortable reaction, a genuine, chilling laugh that froze the entire courtroom in collective horror. She thought her age would shield her from real consequences. She thought being a teenage girl meant the system would go easy on her. She thought her lawyers could convince everyone this was mental illness, not pure evil. She was catastrophically wrong, because Judge Patricia Joyce was about to deliver a sentence that would make legal history, ensuring Alyssa Bustamante wouldn't taste freedom until she was 50 years old, if ever. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way, even when a killer hides behind youth and an innocent appearance. If you believe in accountability for those who prey on children, subscribe now and share your thoughts below. Tell us what you think real justice looks like. This is how it all began. St. Martin's, Missouri, a tiny unincorporated community of about 1,000 residents nestled in the rolling hills outside Jefferson City. It's the kind of place where dense woods surround dirt roads, where kids ride bikes freely until the streetlights come on, where neighbors are family and doors stay unlocked. It's a place where everyone knows everyone, where trust is given freely and where tragedy simply isn't supposed to happen, especially not to children. Elizabeth Olten was 9 years old, a fourth grader with a gap-toothed smile and an infectious giggle who lived with her grandparents just 500 feet away from the Bustamante family. She looked up to her teenage neighbor Alyssa, thought she was the coolest person in the world, wanted to be just like her when she grew up. On October 21, 2009, Elizabeth asked her grandmother if she could go play at the neighbor's house before dinner. Her grandmother said yes, reminding her to be home by 7. Elizabeth skipped out the door, pigtails bouncing, calling, "Love you, Grandma," as she disappeared down the dirt road. She had no idea that Alyssa had been planning her murder for 6 months. She had no idea that a grave was already waiting for her in the woods, and she had no idea that she would never make it home for dinner. Chapter 1. The Laugh That Shattered a Courtroom. The Cole County Courthouse in Jefferson City, Missouri, is a building designed to command respect. Its high ceilings, polished wood paneling, and stern portraits of judges past create an atmosphere of solemnity and justice. In February 2012, the air inside Courtroom 3 was so thick with tension you could barely breathe. Every seat was filled, every eye focused on the defense table where 18-year-old Alyssa Bustamante sat in an orange jumpsuit. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she looked younger than her years, almost childlike in her appearance. But there was nothing childlike about what the prosecutor was describing to the jury. As Mark Richardson methodically detailed how Alyssa had lured 9-year-old Elizabeth Olten into the woods, how she had strangled the child until she lost consciousness, how she had then produced a knife and slit Elizabeth's throat from ear to ear before stabbing her 7 times in the chest, the courtroom listened in horrified silence. Parents in the gallery clutched each other, unable to comprehend how a teenage girl could commit such unspeakable violence against a child. And then something happened that no one could have prepared for. When Patty Price, Elizabeth's grandmother, collapsed sobbing at the description of her granddaughter's final moments, Alyssa's lips curled into an unmistakable smirk. And then she laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh or an involuntary reaction to stress. It was a genuine, quiet laugh, the kind you might give when you find something genuinely amusing. The sound cut through the courtroom like a knife. Several jurors gasped audibly. The judge's eyes widened in disbelief, and Elizabeth's family members in the front row looked at Alyssa with expressions that mixed horror, rage, and complete incomprehension. How could anyone laugh at a grandmother's grief over her murdered grandchild? The disconnect between the gravity of the crime and Alyssa's reaction was so profound that it seemed almost incomprehensible. The visual contrast was equally disturbing. On the prosecution table sat Alyssa's school photo from just a few years earlier. A fresh-faced teenager with a bright smile, an honor roll student, a member of the church youth group. She looked like any typical American teenager, someone you might see at the mall or the movies, someone completely ordinary and unthreatening. But beside that innocent photo sat crime scene descriptions that painted a picture of unimaginable brutality. A child's body in a shallow grave, throat slashed so deeply it nearly severed the head, multiple stab wounds penetrating vital organs, evidence of desperate struggle and terror. Alyssa genuinely believed her age would protect her from serious consequences. She had told friends before her arrest that even if she got caught, she would just go to juvenile detention until she turned 21 and then be released. She thought the legal system was designed to give teenagers second chances, to prioritize rehabilitation over punishment. She thought being a 15-year-old girl at the time of the murder meant judges and juries would see her as a child who made a terrible mistake rather than as a predator who had planned and executed the murder of an innocent child. She was wrong about everything. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically when Judge Patricia Joyce began to speak. Her voice was measured, but carried an unmistakable edge of steel. She wasn't looking at a troubled child who deserved compassion. She was looking at a convicted murderer who had shown the court exactly who she was through months of disturbing testimony and evidence. "Miss Bustamante," Judge Joyce said, her words cutting through the silence, "you have shown this court that evil can wear the face of youth and femininity. You planned this murder for months. You dug a grave in preparation. Yet you lured a trusting child to her death. You murdered her with extreme brutality, and you showed no remorse. In fact, you described it as amazing in your own diary." For the first time since the trial began, Alyssa's smirk faltered. You could see the realization slowly dawning on her face as she began to understand what was about to happen. The judge was about to deliver a sentence that would make legal history in Missouri, a sentence that would ensure Alyssa wouldn't see freedom until she was 50 years old, and possibly never. 35 years minimum before parole eligibility meant spending the prime of her life behind bars, meant missing everything that makes life worth living, meant growing old in a cell. The smile disappeared from her face, replaced by something that looked almost like genuine shock. But to understand how an honor student from a small Missouri town became a child killer, we need to go back 2 years. We need to meet the little girl whose only mistake was trusting her teenage neighbor. Chapter 2. Elizabeth Olten. The Light That Was Stolen. St. Martin's, Missouri exists in that beautiful rural space between small town and countryside. With a population hovering around 1,000 residents, it's technically an unincorporated community just outside Jefferson City, the state capital. Rolling hills covered in dense forests stretch in every direction. Dirt roads wind between modest homes where families have lived for generations. It's the kind of place where the school bus driver knows every child by name, where the local church is the center of social life, where Friday night means high school football, even if you have to drive 20 minutes to the nearest actual high school. Most importantly, it's a place where children are safe, or at least it was supposed to be. Elizabeth Olten was 9 years old in the fall of 2009, a fourth grader at Cedar Creek Elementary School who embodied everything pure and good about childhood. She had lived with her maternal grandparents, Patty and Lonnie Price, since she was an infant. Her mother had struggled with addiction issues and couldn't provide a stable home, so Patty and Lonnie had stepped in without hesitation to raise their granddaughter. They had given up their retirement dreams, their plans for travel and relaxation, to provide Elizabeth with the loving, stable home every child deserves. And Elizabeth had thrived under their care, becoming a child who radiated joy and kindness to everyone around her. Teachers and classmates described Elizabeth as pure sunshine, one of those rare children who seems to make everyone around them happier just by being present. She had a gap-toothed smile that lit up her entire face and an infectious giggle that could make even the grumpiest adult smile. She was obsessed with Hannah Montana, could sing every song from memory, and dreamed of being a performer someday. Her bedroom walls were covered with posters of her favorite singers and drawings she had made herself. But what really defined Elizabeth was her heart. She was the kind of child who volunteered to help younger students at recess, who shared her lunch with kids who forgot theirs, who made handmade cards for nursing home residents she had never met. Aunt Elizabeth had a special hobby that perfectly captured her innocent, creative spirit. She collected rocks from the woods near her home, ordinary rocks that most people would walk right past. But Elizabeth saw potential in every stone. She would bring them home, carefully paint little faces on them with craft paints, and give each one a name and a personality. Her grandmother kept every single rock Elizabeth had ever painted, displaying them on shelves throughout the house like precious treasures. Because to Patty and Lonnie, they were precious, each one a reminder of their granddaughter's boundless creativity and her ability to see beauty and possibility in the simplest things. The Price family lived on a quiet dirt road in St. Martin's, in a modest but well-maintained home filled with love and laughter. Elizabeth shared the house with her grandparents and her 6-year-old twin brothers, whom she adored with a fierce protective love. She would read to them before bed, help them with their homework, defend them from bullies at school. Patty worked at the local hospital as a nurse, while Lonnie was a retired railroad worker who spent his days doing odd jobs and taking care of the property. They had sacrificed so much to raise their grandchildren, but they never complained. They called it their second chance to get it right. The fatal connection that would end Elizabeth's life was simple geography and misplaced trust. The Bustamante family lived on the same rural road, just 500 feet away from the Price home. Alyssa Bustamante was 15 years old, a high school student who occasionally babysat Elizabeth and her brothers. To the Price family and to Elizabeth herself, Alyssa seemed responsible and trustworthy. She was polite, she showed up on time, she seemed to genuinely enjoy spending time with the younger children. Elizabeth absolutely adored Alyssa, looked up to her as the cool teenager she wanted to be like someday. The afternoon of October 21st, 2009 started like hundreds of others before it. Elizabeth got off the school bus at 3:45 p.m., her backpack bouncing as she ran up the driveway to show her grandmother the artwork she had made in class that day. It was a drawing of her family, stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun, everyone smiling. Patty praised the drawing and hung it on the refrigerator with a magnet, right next to dozens of other pieces of Elizabeth's artwork. Then she made Elizabeth an afternoon snack, apple slices with peanut butter, her granddaughter's favorite, and they sat at the kitchen table talking about the school day. At 6:15 p.m., with dinner still an hour away, Elizabeth asked if she could go play at a neighbor's house. She didn't specify which neighbor, and Patty didn't ask. In St. Martin's, children played freely between houses, and Elizabeth knew all the families on their road. Patty reminded her to be home by 7 p.m. for dinner and gave her a quick hug. Elizabeth grabbed her favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear she had named Mr. Snuggles, and skipped out the door, her pigtails bouncing with each step. "Love you, Grandma," she called over her shoulder. Those would be the last words Patty would ever hear her granddaughter say. Elizabeth walked into those woods expecting to play with her teenage neighbor. Instead, she walked into a nightmare that had been meticulously planned and was patiently waiting for her. Chapter 3. The Grave That Was Waiting. The crime scene reconstruction conducted by Missouri State Highway Patrol investigators over the following weeks revealed details so chilling that even experienced homicide detectives struggled to maintain their professional composure. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of lost control. This was premeditated murder, planned with the kind of methodical attention to detail that you might see in someone planning a vacation or a school project. Alyssa Bustamante had spent days preparing for Elizabeth's murder, and the evidence of that preparation was impossible to ignore. Several days before October 21st, Alyssa had gone into the dense woods behind her family's property with a shovel. The woods were thick with trees and undergrowth, providing natural cover from neighboring houses. She had walked deep enough that she wouldn't be visible from any road or residence, and then she had started digging. Not just one grave, but two, practicing the physical labor, testing the soil, measuring depths to ensure they would be adequate. She had told her younger sister that she was preparing for something big, and when her sister asked what she meant, Alyssa had smiled mysteriously and said it was a surprise. At approximately 6:25 p.m. on October 21st, Alyssa intercepted Elizabeth on the path between their properties. Forensic analysis of the timeline, based on neighbor sightings and Elizabeth's known movements, places this as the moment when Elizabeth's fate was sealed. Alyssa told her that she had built a cool fort in the woods and wanted to show it to her. Elizabeth, excited and trusting, followed eagerly. They walked deeper into the dense forest, away from houses and roads, away from any possibility of help. Alyssa led her directly to the area where she had dug the graves, though Elizabeth wouldn't have recognized what they were beneath the careful covering of leaves and branches. At 6:30 p.m., based on the forensic timeline established by investigators, the attack began. Without warning, without any provocation or argument, Alyssa grabbed Elizabeth from behind. Her hands wrapped around the child's small throat, applying pressure with deliberate intent. Elizabeth struggled desperately. The forensic evidence would later show that she fought with everything she had, scratching and clawing, trying to scream. But Alyssa was older, bigger, stronger, and she had the element of surprise. She strangled Elizabeth until the child lost consciousness, though the strangulation alone didn't end her life immediately. The medical examiner's report would later detail violence that was almost incomprehensible in its brutality, especially when inflicted on a child by a teenager. While Elizabeth lay unconscious on the forest floor, Alyssa produced a knife she had hidden in her jacket, a weapon she had brought specifically for this purpose. She positioned herself over the unconscious child and, with deliberate force, slit Elizabeth's throat from ear to ear. The wound was so deep it severed both carotid arteries and the trachea, causing massive blood loss. But Alyssa didn't stop there. She then stabbed Elizabeth repeatedly in the chest, 7 distinct wounds, each one penetrating vital organs, including the heart and both lungs. Perhaps the most haunting detail that would emerge during the investigation was Alyssa's own admission that Elizabeth had regained consciousness briefly during the attack. The child's eyes had opened, and she had looked directly at Alyssa, understanding in that terrible moment what was happening to her. Alyssa would later tell police with disturbing casualness, "She looked at me. She knew what was happening." Those were Elizabeth's final moments: terror, pain, and the betrayal of realizing that someone she trusted and admired was ending her life. After Elizabeth stopped moving, after her desperate struggles had ceased, and her small body lay still on the forest floor, Alyssa went about the business of disposal with chilling efficiency. She dragged the child's body to one of the pre-dug graves, the one she had apparently decided was the right size and depth. She rolled Elizabeth into the shallow hole, positioning her like she was arranging furniture. According to Alyssa's own later account to police, she stood over the grave for several minutes, just looking down at what she had done, feeling the moment. Then she covered the body with dirt and leaves, carefully arranging the surface to look undisturbed. The most disturbing evidence of Alyssa's state of mind would be discovered later, but it's important to understand what happened in the hours immediately after the murder. Alyssa washed the blood from her hands and the knife in her bathroom sink. She changed out of her blood-spattered clothes, hiding them in the back of her closet. She cleaned the knife and returned it to the kitchen. Then she sat down with her family for dinner, eating and making conversation as if nothing whatsoever had happened. After dinner, before heading to her church youth group meeting, she went to her bedroom and pulled out her diary. What she wrote would become the most damning piece of evidence in the entire case. I just killed someone, I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them, now they're dead. I don't know how to feel ATM. It was amazing. As soon as you get over the "oh my God, I can't do this" feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. At 7:15 p.m., Patty Price began to worry. Elizabeth was never late for dinner, and she always came home when she was told to. By 8 p.m., genuine panic had set in. She called the police. By 9 p.m., the entire community had mobilized. Search teams, K-9 units, volunteers with flashlights combing through the woods and fields. And incredibly, Alyssa Bustamante joined the search, helping to look for the girl she had murdered just hours earlier, even comforting Elizabeth's crying twin brothers. The discovery came 48 hours later. Searchers found disturbed earth in the woods behind the Bustamante property. A cadaver dog alerted to the location. Officers uncovered Elizabeth's body in a shallow grave, still wearing her pink jacket, still clutching her stuffed animal. She had been buried like trash, discarded after serving her purpose as Alyssa's experiment in killing. And just 500 feet away, her killer was pretending to grieve. Chapter 4. I Did It. It Was Fun. Within hours of discovering Elizabeth's body, investigators had focused their attention on Alyssa Bustamante with laser-like intensity. The circumstances were simply too suspicious to ignore. She was the last known person to see Elizabeth alive, lived closest to where the grave was found, and had shown inappropriate behavior during the search. Detective Sergeant Rick Hess, a 20-year veteran of law enforcement, had noticed it immediately. While other searchers were frantic and emotional, desperate to find Elizabeth alive, Alyssa had been casual, almost entertained. Something was off from the very beginning, Hess would later testify. Most people searching for a missing child are beside themselves with worry. She seemed more interested than concerned. On the afternoon of October 23rd, just hours after Elizabeth's body was discovered, police brought Alyssa to the station for what they termed a witness interview. She arrived with her mother, appearing calm and cooperative. She wasn't under arrest at this point, wasn't being accused of anything. Officially, she was just a neighbor who might have information about Elizabeth's disappearance and death. But every officer in that station knew they were looking at their primary suspect. The question was whether they could get her to admit it. The initial questioning focused on establishing a timeline. When had Alyssa last seen Elizabeth? Had she noticed anything unusual that evening? Did she know of anyone who might want to hurt Elizabeth? Alyssa's answers came smoothly, almost too smoothly. She said she had seen Elizabeth walking near her house around 6:30 p.m., but hadn't spoken to her. She said she had been in her room most of the evening, listening to music and doing homework. Her story was detailed and consistent, but there was something mechanical about her responses, something rehearsed. There was no emotional inflection when she discussed the murdered child who had been her neighbor. Detective Hess decided to employ a strategic technique that had served him well over his career. He leaned forward, made direct eye contact with Alyssa, and delivered a statement with absolute conviction. "Alyssa, we found Elizabeth. She's dead. She was murdered." He watched her face carefully, looking for any reaction. For just a fraction of a second, Alyssa's eyes flickered with what might have been surprise. But she recovered quickly. "Oh my God, that's terrible," she said, her voice flat despite the words. "Do you know who did it?" Detective Hess let the question hang in the air for a moment, maintaining eye contact. Then he said quietly, "Yes, we do, and we need you to tell us the truth now." There was a long pause, perhaps 30 seconds that felt like an eternity in that small interrogation room. Alyssa looked down at her hands, then back up at the detective. And then, incredibly, she smiled slightly. It wasn't a nervous smile or an uncomfortable grimace. It was a genuine smile, the kind you might give when you've been caught in a clever lie. "Okay," she said simply. "I did it." What followed was one of the most chilling confessions in Missouri criminal history. Alyssa described the murder with clinical detachment, as if she were describing a science experiment rather than the brutal killing of a child. She used phrases like, "I wanted to know what it felt like," and "it was kind of exciting." There was no emotion in her voice, no horror at what she had done, no recognition that she was describing something monstrous. When Detective Hess asked why she had chosen Elizabeth as her victim, Alyssa's response was delivered with disturbing matter-of-factness. She was available. She trusted me completely. That made it easier. While Alyssa was confessing in the interrogation room, crime scene technicians were building an ironclad physical case that would corroborate every detail of her admission. Her fingerprints were found on the shovel that had been used to dig the graves. Elizabeth's blood was discovered on shoes hidden in the back of Alyssa's closet. Elizabeth's DNA was found under Alyssa's fingernails, biological evidence of the desperate struggle the child had put up. The knife recovered from Alyssa's bedroom matched the wound patterns on Elizabeth's body with scientific certainty. Her phone's GPS data placed her at the gravesite during the exact time frame when the murder occurred. The digital evidence was equally damning. Forensic analysts examining Alyssa's computer uncovered a search history that proved extensive premeditation and planning. The searches dated back 6 months and included queries like, how to murder someone and get away with it? What does it feel like to kill someone? How long does it take to dig a grave? And can police find bodies in woods? Her YouTube viewing history showed hundreds of videos about serial killers and violent crime. She had left comments on some of these videos, statements like, "I want to try this." The diary discovery came during the execution of a search warrant at Alyssa's bedroom. Investigators found it hidden under her mattress, a purple notebook with hearts and flowers on the cover. The contents were anything but typical. They found the entry from October 21st, written in Alyssa's distinctive handwriting, describing the murder as amazing and enjoyable. The interrogation video would become one of the most powerful pieces of evidence at trial. The freeze-frame image of Alyssa leaning back casually in her metal chair, arms crossed, a slight smile on her face while describing how she murdered a 9-year-old child would be seared into the memory of everyone who saw it. She had confessed to killing a child. She had smiled through the details. She had shown no remorse, no horror, no recognition that she had done anything wrong. And incredibly, she still believed that her age would somehow save her from serious consequences. She was about to learn just how wrong that assumption was. Chapter 5. The Search History That Revealed a Monster. The Missouri State Highway Patrol's Cyber Crimes Unit spent weeks meticulously analyzing every digital footprint Alyssa Bustamante had left across the Internet. What they discovered was a comprehensive portrait of a teenager who hadn't simply snapped or lost control in a moment of rage. This was someone who had been methodically planning murder for at least 6 months, researching techniques, preparing psychologically, and documenting her journey toward violence. Every search query, every video watched, by every comment left on social media built a timeline of descent into homicidal obsession. The digital evidence revealed an escalating pattern that began in April 2009, 6 months before Elizabeth's murder. The earliest searches were almost tentative. What does it feel like to kill someone? Do people really feel guilty after murder? Can you tell if someone is a killer? By May, the searches had become more practical. How to get away with murder? Do teenagers go to adult prison? What evidence do police look for? July brought searches that showed her research expanding. Famous female serial killers. Youngest person to commit murder. How do serial killers choose victims? In September, just weeks before Elizabeth's death, the searches became chillingly specific. How deep to dig a grave? How long before a body decomposes? The final week before the murder showed searches that proved Alyssa was actively planning Elizabeth's death. How to lure someone into woods? What happens if you kill someone under 10? Can children testify in court? Juvenile sentencing for murder. She was considering every angle, planning for contingencies, trying to understand what would happen if she got caught. This wasn't impulsive violence or a sudden break from reality. This was calculated, methodical preparation for premeditated murder. Alyssa's YouTube viewing history painted an equally disturbing picture. She had watched hundreds of videos about serial killers, violent crime, and murder techniques over the preceding months. Her viewing history included detailed documentaries about Ted Bundy, Aileen Wuornos, Jeffrey Dahmer, and other infamous killers. She had created a playlist on her account titled Inspiration that contained the most violent and graphic content she had found. The social media evidence revealed that Alyssa had been living a double life online. On her public Facebook account, she posted typical teenage content, but investigators uncovered a secret Tumblr account that told a completely different story. She posted photos of graves and cemeteries, quotes about death and violence, and her own writings fantasizing about killing. The Practice Graves discovery added a physical dimension to the digital evidence of planning. A forensic analysis of the woods behind the Bustamante property revealed that Alyssa had dug multiple graves over the preceding months, not just the 2 found near Elizabeth's burial site, but several others in different locations. She had been practicing the physical labor, testing different soil conditions, perfecting her technique. Neighbors who had occasionally seen her in the woods with a shovel had assumed she was gardening or working on some kind of outdoor project. They had no idea she was rehearsing for murder. The court-appointed forensic psychologist, Dr. Michael Armsworth, evaluated Alyssa extensively and produced a report that was both clinically detailed and deeply disturbing. His conclusions were unequivocal. Subject displays pronounced antisocial personality disorder with sadistic features and narcissistic traits. She exhibits a complete absence of empathy and an inability to form genuine emotional connections with others. She views other human beings as objects for experimentation rather than as individuals with inherent worth. Her above-average intelligence has been channeled not toward pro-social goals, but toward planning and executing violence. The defense team attempted to build an insanity defense around Alyssa's mental health history. She had been diagnosed with depression and anxiety, had been prescribed multiple psychiatric medications, and had a documented history of self-harm. But the prosecution had a devastating counter-argument. Alyssa's own digital footprint proved she understood exactly what she was doing and knew it was wrong. The deleted content recovery provided the final nail in the coffin. Your forensic experts recovered text messages that Alyssa had deleted from her phone in the weeks before the murder. She had sent messages to friends saying things like, "I'm planning something crazy, you'll hear about it, and it's going to be big news." These messages established that she knew her planned actions would be considered significant and newsworthy. In other words, she understood that what she was planning was serious and wrong. Every search, every video, every deleted message built an unbreakable case. Alyssa had documented her own descent into evil with the same meticulous attention to detail she had brought to her schoolwork. And now those digital footprints would be used to condemn her. Chapter 6. Try Me as a What? Cole County prosecutor Mark Richardson faced one of the most consequential decisions of his legal career. Under Missouri law, he had 2 distinct options for how to charge Alyssa Bustamante. He could file charges in juvenile court, where she would face a maximum sentence of detention until her 21st birthday, meaning she would be released after serving just 6 years regardless of the severity of her crime. Or he could petition to have her case transferred to adult court, where she would face the full weight of adult criminal penalties, including the possibility of life imprisonment. Given the brutal, premeditated nature of the crime and the complete lack of remorse, Richardson didn't hesitate. At a press conference held on the courthouse steps, Richardson announced his intention to seek adult certification. "This was not an impulsive teenage mistake," he stated firmly. "This was not a moment of poor judgment or a tragic accident. This was a calculated, premeditated, sadistic murder of an innocent child." Alyssa Bustamante spent months planning this killing. She researched murder techniques. She dug graves in preparation. She lured a trusting 9-year-old child to an isolated location and murdered her with extreme brutality. Then she wrote in her diary that it was amazing and enjoyable. The community demands adult accountability for adult crimes. Public defender Charlie Moreland, assigned to represent Alyssa, faced a task that seemed impossible from the very beginning. He couldn't argue innocence. The evidence was overwhelming, and Alyssa had confessed. His only viable strategy was mitigation, attempting to convince the court that despite the horrific nature of the crime, Alyssa's youth and documented mental health issues warranted treatment in the juvenile system rather than adult prosecution. He filed extensive motions arguing that the defendant is a 15-year-old girl suffering from severe mental illness. She was on multiple psychiatric medications that can cause paradoxical reactions in adolescence. Adult prison will destroy any possibility of rehabilitation and treatment. Judge Patricia Joyce presided over a 5-day certification hearing that would determine whether Alyssa would be tried as a juvenile or an adult. The courtroom was packed every single day, with media representatives and community members fighting for seats. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of premeditation. The 6 months of internet searches, the practice graves, the diary entry describing the killing as enjoyable, and Alyssa's own statements about wanting to know what it felt like to kill someone. They argued that this level of planning demonstrated adult-level reasoning that went far beyond typical adolescent impulsivity. During the certification hearing itself, Alyssa's courtroom demeanor became a significant issue that undermined her own defense. She displayed shocking, inappropriate behavior that seemed to prove the prosecution's point about her lack of genuine remorse. She smiled during testimony about Elizabeth's injuries. She doodled hearts and flowers on her legal pad during victim impact statements. She yawned visibly during psychological testimony about her lack of empathy. When Judge Joyce asked Alyssa directly if she understood that these proceedings would determine her entire future, Alyssa shrugged with apparent indifference. "I guess so," she said. "Whatever happens, happens." The victim impact testimony during the certification hearing was particularly powerful. Patty Price, Elizabeth's grandmother, took the stand with visible effort. "Alyssa Bustamante murdered my granddaughter," she said, her voice shaking but clear. Elizabeth was a 9-year-old child who trusted her, who looked up to her, who wanted to be just like her. Alyssa strangled her, slit her throat, stabbed her repeatedly, and threw her body in a grave like garbage. Then she went home and wrote that it was amazing and enjoyable. She has shown no remorse whatsoever. If that doesn't warrant adult prosecution, what does? After overnight deliberation, Judge Joyce delivered her ruling with gravity that made clear she understood the historic nature of her decision. While the defendant is chronologically a minor, she began, her actions demonstrate adult-level planning, brutality, and a complete absence of conscience. She researched murder techniques for 6 months. She dug practice graves to prepare. She lured a vulnerable child to an isolated location. She murdered that child with extreme violence. She showed no remorse afterward, instead describing the murder as amazing in her diary. The severity of this crime and the ongoing danger this defendant poses necessitate adult prosecution. Motion granted. Prosecutor Richardson immediately filed formal charges in adult court: first-degree murder and armed criminal action. And under Missouri law at the time, these charges carried a maximum combined sentence of life without the possibility of parole. The media explosion was immediate, with headlines screaming, "Teen girl charged as adult in murder of 9-year-old neighbor." The defense approached the prosecution with a desperate plea offer. Alyssa would plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a sentence that included the possibility of parole. Richardson consulted with the Olton family. Patty Price's answer was unequivocal. No deal. She planned this murder for months. She executed it with extreme brutality. She enjoyed it enough to write about how amazing it was. Let a jury decide her fate. The system had spoken. Alyssa Bustamante would be tried as an adult, but incredibly, she still didn't seem to believe it would matter. She was about to learn the hardest lesson of her life. Chapter 7. Building the Unbreakable Case. Lead prosecutor Mark Richardson assembled a prosecution team that would spend 15 months building what would become one of the most comprehensive murder cases in Missouri history. His war room was filled with evidence binders, each meticulously labeled. Forensic evidence contained DNA analysis, blood spatter reports, and fingerprint matches. Digital evidence held printouts of search histories and social media posts. Confession included transcripts and video of Alyssa's police interview. Diary entry was perhaps the most damning, copies of the handwritten pages where Alyssa described murder as amazing. Each piece of evidence reinforced the others in an unbreakable chain of proof. Public defender. Charlie Moreland faced a task that seemed impossible from every angle. He couldn't dispute the basic facts. Alyssa had killed Elizabeth, and there was overwhelming evidence to prove it. His only viable strategy was mitigation, attempting to convince a jury that despite the horrific nature of the crime, Alyssa's youth, mental illness, and troubled background warranted a sentence that included at least the possibility of eventual release rather than life without parole. He planned to humanize Alyssa through character witnesses, to present her as a sick teenager rather than an evil monster. The forensic pathology analysis conducted by Dr. Keith Norton took months to complete and revealed details that would prove crucial at trial. Aunt Elizabeth had sustained manual strangulation for approximately 3 to 5 minutes, long enough to cause loss of consciousness, but not immediate death. The throat wound was a single deep incision that severed both carotid arteries and the trachea, indicating knowledge of anatomy and deliberate targeting. The 7 stab wounds in the chest showed purposeful targeting of the heart and lungs rather than random stabbing. This wasn't someone who lost control, Dr. Norton would testify. This was methodical, purposeful killing. The crime scene reconstruction built by forensic experts provided a detailed timeline using physical evidence. Leaf patterns and soil disturbance showed that Alyssa had prepared the graves days in advance. Footprint evidence tracked both girls' movements through the woods to the murder site. In showing that Elizabeth had walked willingly, she hadn't been dragged or forced, she had trusted Alyssa and followed her. Blood spatter patterns indicated that Elizabeth had been on the ground when her throat was cut, suggesting she had already been strangled unconscious. The prosecution's witness list was carefully constructed to build both an emotional and evidentiary case. Patty Price would provide devastating personal impact testimony. Elizabeth's teacher would offer character testimony about the victim. Neighbors who had seen Elizabeth walking to her death would establish the timeline. Forensic experts would provide scientific certainty. Dr. Armsworth would testify about Alyssa's antisocial personality disorder while simultaneously destroying any potential insanity defense. The police officers who had taken Alyssa's confession would describe her casual, almost proud demeanor while admitting to child murder. Moreland struggled to find credible character witnesses willing to testify on Alyssa's behalf. Her grandparents were willing, but their testimony ended up undermining the defense case. Teachers gave lukewarm testimony about academic performance, but noted her emotional disconnect and concerning lack of empathy. Former friends distanced themselves after learning about the diary entries. The defense was left relying primarily on paid expert witnesses whose testimony would be systematically dismantled by the prosecution. While awaiting trial, Alyssa accumulated a disturbing record of disciplinary infractions at the detention facility. She fought with other inmates, disrespected staff, attempted to smuggle contraband, and bragged about the murder to other detainees. Corrections officers documented a pattern. Inmate Bustamante shows no remorse, frequently discusses crime with pride, refers to victim with dehumanizing language. The prosecution planned to introduce this evidence to demonstrate ongoing danger and complete absence of rehabilitation potential. The evidence mountain was insurmountable. The verdict seemed inevitable. But in a courtroom, nothing is guaranteed until 12 citizens speak their truth. Chapter 8. Opening Statements. The Battle for a Child's Justice. The trial began in January 2012, 2 years and 3 months after Elizabeth Olten's murder. The Cole County Courthouse had never seen anything like the media circus that descended on Jefferson City. Every major news outlet sent reporters and camera crews. The courthouse implemented special procedures, a lottery system for public seating, designated media areas, additional security screening. The courtroom was packed to capacity, with the Olten family occupying the front row behind the prosecution table, all wearing pink ribbons in Elizabeth's memory. Alyssa Bustamante entered wearing a conservative blouse and skirt that her defense attorney had carefully selected to make her appear younger and more vulnerable. Her hair was styled simply. She wore minimal makeup and glasses she didn't need, purely cosmetic choices meant to make her look more studious and less threatening. The transformation from the smirking teenager of earlier proceedings was deliberate, an attempt to present a softer, more sympathetic image to the jury. Judge Patricia Joyce addressed the jury with unusual gravity before opening statements began. "You are about to hear evidence in a case involving the murder of a 9-year-old child," she said. "You will see graphic crime scene photographs. You will hear detailed autopsy testimony. You will listen to the defendant's own words describing how and why she committed this crime. You must base your verdict solely on the facts presented, not on emotion or sympathy. The defendant's age is a factor you may consider, but youth alone does not excuse premeditated murder." Prosecutor Mark Richardson approached the jury box with controlled intensity. He made direct eye contact with each juror before beginning. "On October 21, 2009, he said, Elizabeth Olten was 9 years old. She loved Hannah, Montana, and she collected rocks and painted little faces on them. She adored her twin brothers and her grandparents who raised her. She trusted her teenage neighbor, Alyssa Bustamante, who sometimes babysat her. That trust cost Elizabeth her life." Richardson methodically walked the jury through the timeline, building his narrative with each detail. He described Elizabeth's innocent character, Alyssa's months of planning, the murder itself, the casual aftermath, the diary confession. He emphasized premeditation through search history, practice graves, and Alyssa's own statements about wanting to know what it felt like to kill. "After murdering Elizabeth," Richardson said, "after strangling her, slitting her throat, and stabbing her 7 times, Alyssa went home and wrote in her diary. These are her exact words. 'I just killed someone. It was amazing. It's pretty enjoyable.' Those are her words, her truth, her genuine reaction to murdering a 9-year-old child." Defense attorney Charlie Moreland took a dramatically different approach, attempting to reframe the narrative from calculated evil to tragic mental illness. "Alyssa Bustamante is 17 years old now, was 15 when this tragedy occurred," he began. "She suffers from severe, documented mental illness. Depression so severe she repeatedly harmed herself, anxiety that made normal interactions difficult. She grew up in a broken home. Her mother was in prison. Her father abandoned the family. She was raised by grandparents who loved her, but struggled to provide the intensive mental health treatment she desperately needed. Moreland argued that the murder was the result of untreated mental illness. The prosecution wants you to see a monster. I'm asking you to see a sick teenager who was failed by every system that should have protected her. Scientific research tells us that teenage brains lack fully developed frontal lobes, the part responsible for judgment and impulse control. Alyssa's brain was further compromised by severe mental illness and psychiatric medications that can cause paradoxical reactions in adolescence. The emotional impact on the Olton family was visible throughout the opening statements. Patty Price sat beside her husband, both wearing pink ribbons and clutching photographs of Elizabeth. Patty's jaw clenched as Richardson described her granddaughter's final moments. Elizabeth's twin brothers sat behind their grandparents, old enough to understand they were at the trial of their sister's killer. Throughout both opening statements, Alyssa maintained the flat, disconnected expression that had characterized her demeanor since her arrest. She never looked at the Olton family, never made eye contact with the jury, never showed any visible emotion. The battle lines had been drawn. The prosecution would argue that Alyssa was a calculating killer who had planned and executed murder with full knowledge. The defense would argue that she was a mentally ill teenager whose brain couldn't comprehend her actions. 12 citizens would decide which narrative was true. Chapter 9. When a diary became a confession. The first witness called by the prosecution was Sheriff's Deputy Mike Lewis, one of the officers who had discovered Elizabeth's grave. His testimony set the emotional tone for everything that would follow. Deputy Lewis was a 15-year veteran, but his voice still shook as he described what he had found. The cadaver dog alerted to disturbed earth behind the Bustamante property, he explained. We began excavating carefully. About 18 inches down, we uncovered pink fabric, her jacket. Then we saw her small hand, still clutching a stuffed animal. As we removed more dirt, the full extent of her injuries became visible. This child had been brutally murdered, and then discarded like she was nothing. Several jurors visibly reacted to Deputy Lewis's testimony, one woman covering her mouth, another shaking his head. The image he painted of a little girl still holding her stuffed animal, even in death, was almost unbearably sad. The prosecution was deliberately building empathy for Elizabeth before presenting the more graphic evidence, helping the jury understand that this wasn't just about legal arguments, but about a real child whose life had been stolen. Patty Price's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She approached the witness stand moving slowly, as if every step required immense effort. She had aged visibly in the 2 years since Elizabeth's death, her face lined with grief that would never fully heal. When asked to describe Elizabeth, Patty's voice was steady, but her eyes were haunted. Elizabeth was sunshine, she said simply. She lit up every room she entered. She was kind to everyone. She trusted Alyssa completely. She looked up to her, wanted to be just like her. That trust is what killed her. Patty described Elizabeth's final afternoon in heartbreaking detail. The artwork from school, the snack they shared, but the conversation about Elizabeth's day. She asked if she could go play at a neighbor's house, Patty explained, her voice beginning to break. I said yes. I told her to be home by 7. She hugged me and said, "Love you, Grandma," and skipped out the door. Those were the last words I ever heard her say. If I had known, if I had just said no. She couldn't continue. Several jurors wiped tears from their eyes. The most devastating part came when Patty described searching for Elizabeth. When she didn't come home for dinner, I knew something was wrong. Elizabeth never missed dinner. We searched for hours, calling her name, walking through woods with flashlights. And Alyssa helped search. She looked me in the eyes and said, "Don't worry, we'll find her." She knew exactly where Elizabeth was. She had put her in that grave. And she watched us suffer while pretending to care. The prosecution then introduced the diary entry, and the courtroom fell into absolute silence. Richardson held up Alyssa's diary, a purple notebook with hearts and flowers on the cover. "This is the defendant's diary," he explained. "I'm going to read an entry she wrote on October 21st, 2009, the same night she murdered Elizabeth." He paused, making eye contact with each juror. Richardson read slowly and deliberately. "I just killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them. Now they're dead. I don't know how to feel ATM. It was amazing. As soon as you get over the "oh my God, I can't do this" feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. I'm kind of nervous and shaky though, right now. "'Kay, I gotta go to church now. LOL. The jury's reaction was visceral and unmistakable. And several jurors sat back as if physically pushed. One woman's mouth fell open in shock. Another shook his head slowly. Several took extensive notes, underlining "amazing" and "enjoyable" multiple times. When the reading ended, uncomfortable silence filled the courtroom. A forensic handwriting expert testified that the diary was definitively written in Alyssa's handwriting with no possibility of forgery. The defense's cross-examination attempted to suggest the diary was private thoughts not meant to be acted upon, but the damage was done. The crime scene photographs were introduced next, shown only to the jury. The reactions were immediate and visceral. Several jurors visibly distressed, wiping tears, clenching jaws in anger. The photos showed the shallow grave, Elizabeth's small body, her pink jacket, the stuffed animal still clutched in her hand, the wounds clearly visible. Dr. Keith Norton, the medical examiner, provided clinical testimony that made the details more horrifying. The victim sustained manual strangulation for 3 to 5 minutes, causing loss of consciousness but not immediate death. Her throat was then cut with a single deep incision. Finally, she was stabbed 7 times in the chest. Any one of these injuries would have been fatal. Together, they represent a sustained, brutal attack on a helpless child. Throughout all of this graphic testimony, Alyssa maintained disturbing composure. No visible distress, no emotional response to the images of the child she had murdered. At one point, during a particularly graphic photo, she leaned over to whisper to her defense attorney. For a courtroom observer later reported she had asked, "How much longer is this going to take?" She appeared bored, impatient, as if sitting through a tedious lecture rather than her own murder trial. The evidence had told the story of brutal child murder. The defendant's diary had told the story of someone who enjoyed it, and the jury was capturing every horrifying detail. Chapter 10. I wanted to know what it felt like. The prosecution's most devastating evidence came from Alyssa Bustamante's own mouth. Prosecutor Richardson warned the jury before playing the confession video. What you're about to hear is the defendant's own words, recorded just hours after Elizabeth's body was discovered. There is no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. She will tell you exactly why she killed Elizabeth and how she felt about it. The courtroom lights were dimmed and the large screen activated, showing the timestamp of 3:15 p.m. on October 23, 2009, less than 48 hours after the murder. The video showed Alyssa in a stark interrogation room, her posture relaxed, almost casual. Detective Rick Hess sat across from her. "Alyssa," he began, "we know you killed Elizabeth. What I need to understand is why. Why would you murder a 9-year-old child?" There was a long pause, perhaps 15 seconds that felt like an eternity. Then Alyssa answered with chilling calmness. "I wanted to know what it felt like," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "To kill someone. I've wondered about it for a long time. Elizabeth was convenient. She trusted me completely, which made it easier. I knew she wouldn't suspect anything." Detective Hess pressed for more details, and Alyssa provided them with disturbing precision. "I dug the graves a few days before. I wanted to make sure I could actually do it, the physical work. I brought the knife from home. I waited until Elizabeth came over. I told her I wanted to show her something cool in the woods. She followed me without questions. Then I did it." When asked what exactly she did, Alyssa was clinical. "Strangled her first. She fought, but she's little, so it wasn't that hard. Then I cut her throat and stabbed her. She stopped moving pretty quickly." The most damning moment came when Detective Hess asked, "Do you feel bad about what you did?" Alyssa considered the question seriously, tilting her head slightly. Then she answered with devastating honesty, "Not really. Should I? I mean, it's done now. Can't change it. And honestly, it was interesting. I learned what I wanted to know." When asked what she learned, Alyssa responded, "That I'm capable of more than I thought, that it's not as hard as people make it seem." The jury's reaction was visceral. Several sat forward, staring at the screen with expressions mixing shock and disgust. One woman shook her head continuously. Another took extensive notes. When the video showed Alyssa actually smiling while describing how Elizabeth had looked at her and knew what was happening, an audible gasp went through the gallery. After the confession video, the prosecution introduced Alyssa's digital timeline. The searches were displayed chronologically. April 2009. What does it feel like to kill someone? June 2009. How to get away with murder. October 2009. How deep to dig a grave. How to lure someone into woods. Text message revelations provided additional proof of premeditation. Alyssa had sent messages to friends weeks before the murder. Planning something big. Can't tell you yet. When friends asked what she meant, she replied, "You'll find out. It's going to be crazy." The evidence about practice graves was particularly chilling. Forensic experts testified about discovering multiple graves in the woods, all dug in the weeks before Elizabeth's murder. This wasn't an impulsive act, the expert testified. This was rehearsed and planned. Alyssa's social media activity provided another window into her psychological state. Posts from her secret account showed escalating obsession with death. "Everyone's so scared of death, but maybe it's actually freeing. Maybe I'll find out soon." The visual presentation to the jury was devastating. On one screen, they saw Alyssa's confession video frozen on her casual expression. On another, Elizabeth's school photo, gap-toothed smile, innocent eyes, unaware she had only days to live. Every word Alyssa had spoken, every search she had made, every grave she had dug, built an unbreakable case. She had confessed to murdering a child for curiosity, and now those words would condemn her. Chapter 11. The defense's impossible task. Defense attorney Charlie Moreland knew he was facing an uphill battle that bordered on impossible. His primary expert witness was Dr. Patricia Chamberlain, a forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Alyssa extensively. Dr. Chamberlain testified about Alyssa's documented mental health history. "She suffers from major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder," she explained. At the time of the crime, she was prescribed multiple psychiatric medications, including Prozac and Effexor. These medications can sometimes cause paradoxical reactions in adolescence, increasing impulsivity, reducing normal inhibitions, causing dissociation from reality. Dr. Chamberlain presented research about antidepressant side effects in teenagers. Scientific literature shows that SSRIs can increase violent ideation and reduce emotional regulation in developing brains, she testified. Ms. Bustamante was on high doses of multiple medications. It's entirely possible that these drugs contributed to her actions by impairing her judgment and ability to process moral wrongfulness. Prosecutor Richardson's cross-examination was methodical and devastating. He had prepared extensively for this moment and systematically dismantled her testimony. "Dr. Chamberlain," he began, "you testified that medications impaired the defendant's judgment, but she researched murder techniques for 6 months before killing Elizabeth, correct?" Dr. Chamberlain nodded. She dug practice graves to prepare, correct? Yes. She lured the victim to an isolated location, correct? Yes. She hid evidence after the crime, correct? Yes. Richardson's voice rose. Doctor, those are the actions of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and knew it was wrong. Richardson saved his most devastating question for last. Doctor, please read this passage from the defendant's diary. He handed her a copy. Dr. Chamberlain read aloud. It was amazing. As soon as you get over the "oh my God, I can't do this" feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. Richardson let the words hang in the air. Doctor, please explain how medication side effects caused the defendant to describe child murder as amazing and enjoyable hours after committing it. Was that the medication talking, or was that her genuine emotional response? The defense also called Alyssa's grandmother, Karen Brooke, for an emotional plea. Karen's testimony was genuine, but ultimately didn't help. She testified tearfully about Alyssa's troubled childhood, her mother's imprisonment, her father's abandonment, the domestic violence Alyssa had witnessed. We tried our best to raise her, Karen sobbed. We got her therapy, medications, tried to give her stability. But she was so troubled. We failed her. If we had done more, maybe Elizabeth would still be alive. The character witness testimony backfired spectacularly. The defense called Alyssa's former youth pastor, hoping for positive testimony. Instead, Alyssa attended our youth group regularly, but I always found her unsettling. She showed no genuine emotion during worship. When we discussed moral issues, she would argue disturbing positions with strange enthusiasm. I thought she was being provocative. Now I realize those weren't intellectual exercises for her. Against his attorney's advice, Alyssa insisted on making a brief statement. What followed was a disaster. She delivered a clearly prepared apology. I'm sorry for what happened to Elizabeth and her family. I know my actions caused terrible pain. I was sick and didn't understand what I was doing. I wish I could take it back. The words were appropriate, but the delivery remained flat and unconvincing. Under cross-examination, Richardson exposed the emptiness of her apology. Miss Bustamante, you said you're sorry, but in your confession video, you said the murder was interesting and you learned what you wanted to know. Which represents your true feelings? Alyssa hesitated. I don't really feel bad about it, she finally admitted. I know I should, but I don't. I can't make myself feel something I don't feel. Richardson pressed. So, your apology wasn't genuine? Alyssa's devastating response. I said what I thought people wanted to hear. But no, I don't actually feel sorry. As Alyssa left the witness stand, her defense attorney put his head in his hands. The jury exchanged glances of disbelief and disgust. She had been given an opportunity to show humanity, remorse, anything resembling normal emotion. Instead, she had confirmed everything the prosecution said about her, that she was incapable of genuine remorse, incapable of empathy, and remained a danger to society. Chapter 12. A Grandmother's Unbearable Grief. The victim impact phase was the emotional core of the proceedings. Patty Price returned to the stand for her full impact statement, and the weight of her grief was visible in every movement. Elizabeth was our second chance, she began, gripping the witness stand. We had raised her mother and made mistakes. When Elizabeth came to live with us as a baby, we promised to do better. We gave her stable home, unconditional love, everything we had. She was sunshine personified, always smiling, always kind, always seeing good in everyone. That goodness is what killed her. Patty described Elizabeth in detail that brought the child to life for everyone in the courtroom. She would volunteer to help younger students at recess, even though it meant giving up her playtime. She would share her lunch with kids who forgot theirs. She made cards for nursing home residents she'd never met, because she thought they might be lonely. That's who Elizabeth was, a child who cared about others, who wanted to make the world better. The description of Elizabeth's final day was almost unbearably painful. That afternoon, she was so excited about her artwork from school. She had drawn our family, all of us holding hands under a bright sun. She told me it was because we were her happy place. We had our snack together, and she told me about a friend at school who was sad. She wanted to invite this friend over because maybe I can make her feel better, Grandma. That's what she was thinking about, helping someone else. And then she asked if she could go play at a neighbor's house. Patty's testimony about the search was devastating. When she didn't come home for dinner, I knew something was wrong. Elizabeth was never late. We searched for hours, calling her name until our voices were hoarse. And Alyssa was right there with us, helping search, comforting Elizabeth's brothers. She looked me in the eyes and said, "Don't worry, we'll find her." She knew exactly where Elizabeth was. She had put her in that grave herself. She watched us suffer and pretended to care. That level of cruelty is almost impossible to comprehend. The most devastating part came when Patty described identifying Elizabeth's body. The police asked me to come to the morgue. I'll never forget walking into that room and seeing my baby on that table. Her throat, her chest, what Alyssa did to her. No grandmother should ever have to see that. No child should ever die that way. Elizabeth's last moments were terror and pain and the betrayal of realizing that someone she trusted was killing her. Patty described the cascading impact on the family. Elizabeth's twin brothers have nightmares every night. Yeah, they're terrified of woods, of being alone, of trusting anyone. They blame themselves for not protecting her. My husband had a heart attack from the stress 3 months after Elizabeth died. I can't work anymore because the PTSD makes it impossible to function. We lost our home to medical bills. We lost everything. But mostly, we lost Elizabeth. And that loss has left a hole in our family that will never heal. Elizabeth's teacher testified about the student she had known. Elizabeth was a special child, kind and empathetic beyond her years. She wrote stories about animals finding homes and families being happy together. She told me she wanted to be a nurse when she grew up, like Grandma, to help people. She'll never get that chance. Her desk is still in my classroom. I assigned it to another student this year. But I put Elizabeth's name tag in my desk drawer. I couldn't throw it away. The community impact was represented by the mayor, who testified about town-wide trauma. This is a small community where everyone knows everyone. Elizabeth was beloved, a Girl Scout, church member, friend to everyone. Her murder has shattered our sense of safety. Parents no longer let children play outside unsupervised. The trust that held our community together has been destroyed. Throughout all of this devastating testimony, Alyssa maintained her disturbing composure. No tears, no visible remorse, no physical reaction to the suffering being described. When Patty described identifying Elizabeth's mutilated body, Alyssa briefly glanced at her, not with sympathy, but with what observers described as mild curiosity. When Elizabeth's brothers cried audibly, Alyssa rolled her eyes slightly. The jury noticed everything. Patty concluded, "Alyssa Bustamante murdered my granddaughter for entertainment. She planned it, executed it, enjoyed it, and wrote about enjoying it. She has shown no genuine remorse." If this court shows her mercy, what message does that send? That murdering children is forgivable? We ask for maximum sentence, not for vengeance, for justice. Elizabeth deserves justice. They had shown her the complete destruction she caused. She had shown them she simply didn't care. Chapter 13. Closing Arguments. The final battle for Elizabeth defense attorney Charlie Moreland approached the jury for his closing argument, knowing he faced an almost impossible task. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, You have heard terrible things. You have seen terrible evidence. But I implore you to remember, Alyssa Bustamante was 15 years old. She suffered from severe, documented mental illness that went undiagnosed and untreated for years. She grew up in an emotionally neglectful home. She consumed violent media that warped her developing mind. She made unforgivable decisions, but she is not irredeemable monster. Moreland continued his humanitarian appeal. The prosecution wants you to see evil incarnate. I'm asking you to see sick child failed by mental health system, failed by family, failed by society. Yes, she should face serious punishment, but destroying her life, sentencing her to die in prison, doesn't bring Elizabeth back. It doesn't heal the Olton family. It just creates more tragedy. Find her guilty of appropriate charges. She'll but recommend mercy in sentencing. Prosecutor Mark Richardson stood for his rebuttal with the weight of the entire case behind him. He made direct eye contact with each juror. The defense wants you to focus exclusively on the defendant's mental illness and age. I want you to focus on her choices. She chose to research murder techniques for 6 months. She chose to dig practice graves. She chose to lure a 9-year-old child into woods. She chose to strangle her, cut her throat, stab her 7 times. She chose to bury her like garbage. She chose to write that it was amazing and enjoyable. These were choices, not symptoms. Richardson systematically dismantled the mental illness defense. Defense says she couldn't control herself due to mental illness and medications, but she controlled herself enough to plan for months without telling anyone. She controlled herself enough to hide evidence. She controlled herself enough to lie to police. She controlled herself enough to help search for Elizabeth while knowing exactly where the body was. That's not mental illness preventing self-control. That's calculation and deception. The age argument fell next. Defense says she was just 15, but she was old enough to spend 6 months researching murder, old enough to understand killing was wrong. We know this because she researched how to avoid getting caught, old enough to plan methodically, old enough to choose a vulnerable victim, old enough to execute that victim with extreme brutality. If she's old enough to do all that, she's old enough to face consequences. Richardson's voice intensified as he brought focus back to the victim. Elizabeth Olton was 9 years old. She loved Hannah Montana. She painted faces on rocks. She wanted to be a nurse to help people. She trusted her teenage neighbor, and that neighbor murdered her for an experience. Not for money, not in self-defense, not in rage, for curiosity, to see what killing felt like. That's not illness, that's depravity. He recapped the evidence with devastating efficiency. You saw crime scene photos. You heard confession video where she said murdering Elizabeth was interesting. You read diary entry calling murder amazing and enjoyable. You heard 6 months of internet searches planning this killing. You watched her testify without genuine remorse. And you saw her roll her eyes during victim impact statements. Through all of it, one truth emerges. Alyssa Bustamante is exactly who she showed you, someone who murdered a child for personal gratification and feels no genuine remorse whatsoever. Richardson's final appeal was powerful. Defense asks for mercy, but mercy requires remorse. Rehabilitation requires recognition of wrongdoing. Defendant has shown neither. She had a plan. She had a victim. She had a motive, twisted though it was. Now she must have consequences. Not because of vengeance, because Elizabeth Olton deserved to live, because her family deserves justice, because this community deserves to know that someone who preys on children will be held fully accountable. As Richardson returned to the prosecution table, he placed a supportive hand on Patty Price's shoulder as she clutched Elizabeth's photograph. The final words had been spoken. 12 citizens would now decide if a teenager who murdered for curiosity deserved life in prison. and everyone knew this verdict would define justice. Chapter 14. The Plea Deal That Shocked Everyone. Before the jury could begin deliberations, a shocking development occurred. The defense approached the prosecution with a last-minute plea offer. After consultation with Alyssa and her family, Charlie Moreland proposed that Alyssa would plead guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action in exchange for the prosecution agreeing not to seek life without the possibility of parole. It was a desperate gambit to avoid the uncertainty of a jury verdict and to secure at least some possibility of eventual release. Prosecutor Richardson consulted extensively with the Olton family before making his decision. The family was divided. Part of them wanted to see this through to a jury verdict, wanted 12 citizens to formally declare Alyssa guilty of first-degree murder. But another part was exhausted, traumatized by weeks of reliving Elizabeth's murder through testimony and evidence. After agonizing deliberation, they agreed to the plea deal. It would guarantee a conviction without the risk of jury deadlock. And under Missouri law, even second-degree murder carried a potential sentence of life in prison with parole eligibility after 35 years. On January 31, 2012, Alyssa stood before Judge Patricia Joyce to enter her formal guilty plea. The courtroom was packed with media representatives and community members. Judge Joyce addressed Alyssa directly. "Miss Bustamante, do you understand that you are pleading guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action?" Alyssa's response came in a flat, emotionless voice. "Yes." "Do you understand that by pleading guilty, you are admitting that you intentionally killed Elizabeth Olton?" "Yes." "Do you understand that you face up to life in prison with this plea?" "Yes." There was no emotion, no remorse, just mechanical responses. As part of the plea agreement, Judge Joyce required Alyssa to provide an allocution, to describe the crime in her own words. What followed was chilling in its casual tone. On October 21, 2009, Alyssa began, her voice flat. "I lured Elizabeth Olton into the woods behind my house. I strangled her until she lost consciousness. Then I used a knife to cut her throat, and I stabbed her multiple times in the chest. After she was dead, I buried her body in a grave I had dug previously. I did this because I wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone." She delivered this confession as if reading a grocery list, with no emotional inflection. Patty Price listened with tears streaming silently. When Alyssa finished, Patty stood up. "You wanted to know what it felt like?" she said loudly, her voice shaking with rage. "Now you're going to know what it feels like to spend your life in prison. I hope you think about Elizabeth every single day for the rest of your life." Judge Joyce banged her gavel, but made no move to silence Patty. The court's sympathy was entirely with the victim's family. But Judge Joyce accepted the guilty plea and scheduled a sentencing hearing for 3 weeks later. The defense requested immediate sentencing, hoping to capitalize on any residual sympathy. But the prosecution objected, wanting time to prepare a comprehensive sentencing memorandum. Judge Joyce sided with the prosecution, giving both sides time to prepare their final arguments. The media explosion was immediate. Headlines proclaimed, "Teen girl pleads guilty to murdering 9-year-old neighbor." "Missouri teen admits killing child to know what it felt like." Diary entry calling murder. "Amazing leads to guilty plea." Legal experts noted, "The plea deal avoids life without parole, but still allows the judge to impose life with parole eligibility after 35 years. That's unprecedented for a female juvenile offender in Missouri. The community response was mixed. There was relief at the guaranteed conviction, but anger that the plea deal had removed the possibility of life without parole. Residents gathered outside the courthouse wearing pink ribbons. The mayor issued a statement. "While we respect the prosecutor's decision and the Olton family's wishes, our community believes Alyssa Bustamante should never walk free. We trust Judge Joyce to impose the maximum sentence." In the 3 weeks between plea and sentencing, Alyssa's behavior in detention continued to be problematic. She accumulated additional disciplinary infractions, fighting with inmates, showing disrespect to staff, refusing to participate in counseling programs. The corrections report noted, "Inmate Bustamante shows no interest in rehabilitation. She continues to discuss the crime with inappropriate affect, showing no genuine remorse. She represents an ongoing threat to public safety." The split-screen image that evening told the story perfectly. On one side, Alyssa being led from the courtroom in shackles after entering her guilty plea, her expression mixing annoyance and resignation rather than remorse. On the other side, Elizabeth's memorial photo displayed in the courthouse lobby, a smiling child surrounded by flowers and teddy bears. She had admitted to murder, but admitting guilt and feeling genuine remorse are very different things. And at the upcoming sentencing hearing, that difference would determine whether Alyssa would ever have a realistic chance at freedom. Chapter 15. Your Age Won't Save You. The historic sentence. The sentencing hearing on February 8, 2012, brought the case to its final historic conclusion. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with the Olton family occupying the front row, all wearing pink ribbons and holding photographs of Elizabeth. Media representatives from across the nation filled the press section. Community members lined the hallways outside, unable to secure seats, but wanting to be present for justice. Security was at maximum levels, with additional bailiffs stationed throughout the courthouse. Defense attorney Charlie Moreland presented his final mitigation evidence with desperation. He called mental health professionals who recommended treatment over permanent incarceration. He presented testimony from a juvenile justice expert about rehabilitation potential. He called Alyssa's grandmother one final time. Karen Brooke approached the witness stand looking like she had aged a decade. "Please don't give up on her completely," she begged, tears streaming. "She's sick. She made a terrible, unforgivable mistake, but she's still my granddaughter. Give her a chance at life someday, even if it's decades from now. Please." Prosecutor Mark Richardson countered with comprehensive aggravating circumstances. He detailed the extreme premeditation, 6 months of planning documented through internet searches and practice graves. He emphasized the brutal method: strangulation, throat slitting, and multiple stab wounds inflicted on a helpless child. He highlighted the victim's vulnerability, a 9-year-old who had trusted Alyssa completely. He stressed the complete lack of genuine remorse and the ongoing danger to society. He requested the maximum sentence, life in prison with parole eligibility after 35 years. Patty Price was given the final opportunity to speak before sentencing. She approached the microphone with visible effort. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "Alyssa Bustamante murdered my 9-year-old granddaughter for entertainment. She planned it for months. She researched murder techniques. She dug graves in preparation. She lured Elizabeth into the woods with lies. She strangled her, slit her throat, and stabbed her repeatedly. She buried her like garbage. Then she went home and wrote that it was amazing and enjoyable. She has shown no genuine remorse, not when arrested, not during interviews, not during trial, not when she entered her plea. Not today. I ask this court to ensure that Alyssa Bustamante never has the opportunity to hurt another child. The maximum sentence is the only appropriate response." Judge Joyce then offered Alyssa one final opportunity to address the court. Alyssa stood and read from a prepared statement, clearly written by her attorney. "I'm sorry for what I did to Elizabeth and her family," she said, her voice flat and expression blank. "I know I caused terrible pain that can never be undone. I was sick and didn't understand what I was doing at the time. I hope that someday, with treatment and time, I can become a productive member of society and that Elizabeth's family can find some measure of peace." The words were technically appropriate, but the delivery remained emotionless and unconvincing. Judge Patricia Joyce paused for a long moment, reviewing the thick file before her. Then she began to speak, and the courtroom fell into absolute silence. This court has carefully considered all evidence, testimony, and arguments presented during the trial and today's hearing, she began, her voice carrying unusual intensity. Miss Bustamante, you were 15 years old when you murdered Elizabeth Olton. That is a significant factor that this court has weighed carefully. However, your actions demonstrated adult-level planning, extreme brutality, and a complete absence of conscience that cannot be attributed solely to youth or mental illness. Judge Joyce continued with devastating clarity. You researched murder techniques for 6 months. You dug practice graves to prepare. You lured a vulnerable child to an isolated location using her trust in you as a weapon. You murdered that child with extreme violence, strangulation, throat slitting, and multiple stab wounds. You showed no remorse afterward, instead describing the murder as amazing and enjoyable in your diary. Throughout this case, you have demonstrated no capacity for genuine remorse or empathy. Your behavior in detention has been consistently problematic. Yet the psychological evaluations indicate you pose an ongoing danger to society with poor prospects for rehabilitation. The judge's voice took on added weight as she approached the actual sentencing. This court's duty is twofold: to protect the public and to deliver justice for the victim. While your age constitutes a mitigating factor, it cannot overcome the severity of your crime, your extensive premeditation, your complete lack of remorse, and the ongoing danger you pose to others. On the charge of second-degree murder, this court sentences you to life imprisonment with eligibility for parole after serving 35 consecutive years. On the charge of armed criminal action, this court sentences you to 25 years to run consecutive to the murder sentence. Your total effective sentence is life plus 25 years. With parole eligibility after 35 years served. Then came the moment that would make headlines and give the case its lasting impact. Judge Joyce leaned forward, staring directly at Alyssa with intensity that commanded everyone's attention. Miss Bustamante, I want to be absolutely clear about something, she said, her voice carrying moral authority that transcended legal formality. Your age will not save you from the consequences of your depravity. You chose to murder a child for entertainment, for curiosity, for the experience of knowing what killing felt like. You will be 50 years old before you can even apply for parole. And I want to state for the record that this court recommends parole be denied at every hearing. You have shown this court and this community that you are incapable of genuine remorse, incapable of empathy, and incapable of being trusted in free society. You chose to take Elizabeth Olton's life. Now you will live with that choice for the rest of your natural life. The courtroom erupted in controlled emotion. The Olton family embraced, crying with relief and closure. Patty collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing, "Thank you, Judge. Thank you for Elizabeth." Elizabeth's twin brothers hugged their grandparents tightly. Community members began to applaud until Judge Joyce restored order. Alyssa's grandmother wailed inconsolably. Alyssa herself showed genuine emotion for the first time, not remorse, but shock and anger. As the reality of the sentence sank in, her carefully maintained composure finally cracked. As bailiffs approached with shackles, she turned to the Olton family and shouted, "I said I was sorry. What more do you want from me?" Her voice was filled with rage and self-pity rather than recognition of the suffering she had caused. Patty Price stood, her voice steady despite overwhelming emotion. "We want Elizabeth back," she said clearly. "Since we can't have that, we'll settle for you spending your life in prison where you can never hurt another child. You took her life. Now justice has taken yours." Alyssa was dragged from the courtroom still shouting, no longer smirking, finally understanding the permanence and severity of the consequences. The headlines told the story. Judge to teen killer. Your age won't save you. Missouri teen sentenced to life for murdering 9-year-old neighbor. Historic sentence sets legal precedent. Legal experts noted the significance. This case establishes that extreme premeditation and brutality can override age considerations even for female juvenile offenders. Judge Joyce's sentence will be cited for decades in juvenile certification and sentencing hearings. Alyssa Bustamante is currently incarcerated at Chillicothe Correctional Center in Missouri, serving her life sentence. She will be 50 years old in 2044 when she first becomes eligible for parole consideration. Correctional records show multiple disciplinary infractions, no participation in rehabilitation programs, and no genuine remorse expressed. Her parole board members have indicated she represents an ongoing threat to public safety, and release is highly unlikely. The community held a memorial service for Elizabeth at her elementary school. A bronze plaque was installed. In loving memory of Elizabeth Olton, whose light was stolen, but whose memory will never fade, may her kindness and innocence never be forgotten. Over 800 people attended. Patty spoke briefly. Elizabeth loved everyone, even the person who killed her. I'm trying to honor her memory by not letting hatred consume me. But I'm grateful that justice was served. I'm grateful that Judge Joyce saw through the excuses and delivered a sentence that protects other children. If you believe justice was served in this case, make sure others see this story. And ask yourself the difficult questions. Should someone who murders a child for curiosity ever deserve a second chance? Was a life sentence appropriate for a 15-year-old, or should youth always mean the possibility of redemption? At what point does the severity of a crime override considerations of age? Share your thoughts below, and let's have a real conversation about what justice looks like when children commit unthinkable acts. The laugh that had shocked the courtroom disappeared forever behind prison walls. The smirk that had enraged a community was replaced by the reality of a life sentence. The gavel fell with finality, and justice, confronting evil wearing the face of youth, spoke with a voice that would echo for a lifetime. Alyssa Bustamante's lifetime behind bars. Your age won't save you when you murder innocence. On your youth won't protect you when you plan and execute the killing of a child, and your tears, when they finally come, will be decades too late for the little girl who trusted you and paid for that trust with her life.